There's a lot of stuff people don't tell you, isn't there? How many know someone who's had a tattoo or got one? How many know someone? Oh, look at that, hands up everywhere. There's almost no one that doesn't know someone with a tattoo. It's a growing phenomenon now, is people getting tattoos. Tremendous increase in that's taken place since the 70s, and just a huge increase. Actually, the increase in getting tattoos is paralleled by the latest increase, and that is trying to get rid of them. There's a huge business developing in America, people trying to get rid of tattoos. So we look around, you see celebrities have them, sports stars have them, athletes have them, and it's just like it's making a great comeback. And you see it everywhere, and so you think, well, is there anything to it, Is there anything about it? Well, God looks on the outside, and God looks on the inside, man looks on the outside. Let's not worry or sweat about it. But I believe we need to understand what lies behind these things. And I'm going to show you why this is so important. And I wanted to share with you something that will help you, just give you a little bit of insight. There's not many Bible verses about tattoos, but there are some references around in the Bible. So I want to start with looking at the Word of God. I want to look in Leviticus, and we look in Leviticus chapter 19 and verse 28. And this is what you need to understand is the context of this. When we look in the Bible, in the Old Testament, and these sections of the Old Testament, God had taken a people out of Egypt. His people, Israel, were in bondage in Egypt, and they were in bondage not just in slavery to Egyptians, they were actually in slavery to occult powers. If you remember the story of how Moses confronted the Pharaoh, it would have been real easy for God to just get him out on the first confrontation. Actually, there were 10 confrontations. And each of the confrontations was with a different god that was one of the gods of Egypt. And every time that Moses told the Pharaoh, let my people go, and the Pharaoh refused, there was a plague would come into the nation. And it was an attack on the foreign gods. And so after the 10 plagues, by the time I got to the end, the people in the nation were aware that the power of God was greater than the power of the gods that the Egyptians served. Notice this, the final miracle that got the people of God released was the shedding of blood. In Exodus 12, everyone had to slay a lamb. They had to apply the blood of the lamb to their house, to their building, and only there would they be protected from a destroying angel. And so we find that Israel was delivered out of a land full of idolatry, witchcraft, and spiritism. Occult powers were immensely strong in Egypt. If you read the story of Moses' confrontation with the wizards of Egypt, you find that some of the first miracles he did, they were able to duplicate. He threw a stick down on the ground, it turned into a snake. They threw their sticks down, and they also turned into snakes. That is some occultic power. So the first 3 miracles that Moses did, the wizards of Egypt, operating in sorcery and occult powers, were able to duplicate them. Perhaps what isn't known so much is that the Egyptians were worshippers of Baal, the sun god, and part of the Baal worship involved both men and women being tattooed as a sign of ownership and allegiance to that god. Now, when this verse comes up here in Leviticus, God is about to bring his people into the promised land, Canaan. And he said, I'm not bringing you in there because you're better than them. I'm bringing you in there because I love you, you're my people. And it says, because of what they have done. And so when you look into the Bible about what they were doing in this land, there was strong and huge occultic involvement. The nations worshipped Baal. They worshipped Ashtoreth. So they worshipped the gods of the sun. They worshipped the gods of the storm and the winds and the weather. They worshipped the gods of fertility. And they had tremendous perverse acts went with it. And they got themselves tattooed. It was part of the allegiance to their gods that they had the tattoos. Tattoos just a mark in ink. But actually, it's what it opens your life to is what's important. And so when God gives this command, he's talking in the context of making sure you don't get defiled by demonic powers. See? And notice what he says here if you read in verse 4, do not turn to idols nor make yourself molded gods, for I am the Lord your God. Now, you notice in verse 28, he says, you shall not make any cuttings in your flesh. Don't mark, cut, or destroy or blemish your flesh for the dead, nor any tattoo marks on you, for I am the Lord. You go down a little further, and then he begins to talk more in chapter 20 and verse 1. He talks about then the practices in the land. So this scripture on tattooing is set in the context of a cult involvement that went on in Egypt and went on in Canaan. And God was quite strong and very forceful in his directions about being involved in the occult. He said, do not be defiled by them. Do not do any of these abominations. In other words, do not open your life to occult practices in any way. You will give room for demonic powers to enter your life. So the reason that God set this principle in place was because he knew the connection between tattooing and the occult realm. We'll explain what that connection is in a moment. He wanted to keep his people free from occult involvement so that they could walk in the blessings and inherit their land. And we'll see how significant that is for us just shortly. So, the only other places that there are references to this kind of thing, of the cutting of the flesh, are found in 1 Kings 18. You remember the story when Elijah had a confrontation with the prophets of Baal. And when he had a confrontation with them, he called on them to demonstrate the power, the supernatural power of their gods. And what they did was they began to cut their flesh. They made themselves bleed. And he just mocked them and belittled them and then demonstrated the true power of a covenant-keeping God. In the New Testament, there's a story of a man called the Gadarene in Mark chapter 5. When we look at that man, he was heavily demonized. He had a legion of demons in him. That's 6,000 demons. Here's the interesting, it said that when he came near Jesus, the demons began to manifest, and the guy used to cut himself. So you notice the cutting, the marking of the flesh in the Bible is continually associated with the occult realm and with bondage or slavery or servitude to that. So in a number of places in the Bible, it talks about the issue of blood and bloodshed. When God began a walk with Abraham, one of the things he required Abraham to do was to cut a covenant with him. A covenant is the most strong or the most binding agreement that could be made between two people or between a person and God. Covenant is what God is a covenant-keeping God. So covenants in the Bible, God instructed him how to make a covenant. And it involved these things. He had a sacrifice. There was a sacrifice. There was a loss of an animal. An animal shed its life. So he killed the animal and cut it in two, and the blood was sprinkled there, and then the two people making covenant would walk between the two parts of the animal, and various promises were made or commitments were made. But a blood covenant or a covenant, one of the things that characterized covenants in the Bible, always there was the shedding of blood. So when you see any practice that involves the shedding of blood, you are looking at covenant formation. Anything that deliberately involves the shedding of blood involves the forming of covenant. A covenant is a binding agreement between two people that gives legal rights and entitlements. Okay, then now let me give you one other example that's an interesting one, and that's found in the area of marriage. Now, the first time that when a couple come together and they make a marriage covenant, notice this, they come up, wedding is not something people thought up. Wedding is a covenantal commitment to one another. It's not just like living together, it's a covenantal commitment. So when two people become married, what they do is they meet together and they make covenant with one another. They speak to one another, declaring their relationship, declaring their commitment. They do it publicly so people hear it and see it, and then you sign the book, they sign the register, and they are married, except for one thing. If they do not have sexual intercourse, it's considered legally that they're not married. And the marriage can be annulled immediately. The first time that a woman has sexual intercourse with a man, God has designed the woman and created a woman so that in the first act of intercourse, there is the breaking of the hymen and the shedding of blood. Shedding of blood. Shedding of blood in the first act of intercourse is an evidence that covenant has been formed. So every time in the Bible you see references to the shedding of blood, it is about covenant, two people being bonded together. And in fact, it was so important in the Bible in Deuteronomy 22:15 that if there was ever doubt that a woman had been a virgin before she was married, if a husband became cranky and got complaining about his wife and said she wasn't a virgin, she'd had other men, the parents would bring the bedclothes from the first night they had sexual intercourse, and they had blood marks on them, and they would call them the tokens of virginity, and they would use this as a proof that she was a virgin the night she was married. So consistently through the Bible, the shedding of blood is connected to covenant formation. And a tattoo. So what happens in a tattoo? On a tattoo, you use a needle or some kind of cutting instrument. It can be a chisel or it can be a needle. It's moving very, very fast. And what it does is it penetrates the flesh, blood is shed. If you notice, you'll see when a tattoo's being done, they're continually wiping away the blood that comes. The skin has been pierced. What is happening is now there is pain, there's sacrifice, there is blood shed. You can't escape it that when blood is shed, there is some kind of covenant form. Among the Indians, North American Indians, if you wanted to enter into covenant with a person, you cut the hand and you touched the blood one against another and you became blood brothers.